Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, the first of the webinars associated with the Shaping Urban Futures MOOC. My name is Neha Sami. I'm faculty at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, and I'm delighted to have Andrew Tucker, Deputy Director at the African Center for Cities, here with me, joining us in what we hope will be a lively and fun discussion. So before I start, before we start sort of getting into the meat of the discussion itself, I wanted to kind of ask Andy to introduce himself, say a little bit about his kind of trajectory and background, and perhaps also introduce ACC. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you very much, Neha, and hello to everyone. My name is Andrew Tucker, and as Neha said, I'm the Deputy Director at the African Center for Cities. My own background, just very briefly, is perhaps something that we might want to delve into a bit more in terms of the actual discussion, because as much as this webinar is about locating the urban South and international knowledge platforms, as you can tell by my accent, I'm not originally from the urban South. I'm originally from the United Kingdom. And I'm also half Chinese. So just in terms of positionality, which is something that I think we're going to touch on, it's just worth bearing in mind that although I've lived in the South now for about 8 years, and I've been doing research on it for a long time, my own positionality is a bit more complex. Just about the African Center for Cities. So for those of you that don't know, the ACC is one of the main urban research centers in the Global South. It particularly focuses on African urbanization, but has particular connections and synergies and collegiate relationships with other partners across the urban South. And we engage with wider Global South debates as well. So you can find out more about us at africancenterforcities.net. That's our website. And as some of you may have heard, and I think we'll touch a bit about this in the discussion, we've just had our African Infrastructures Conference, which has been getting some play on social media. So I'm also happy to talk more about that. But thank you, Neha. I think that's my intro done.
Thanks, Andrew. So what we just in the same vein, I'm from India. I work in India, but I'm trained overseas. And so I think similar to Andy, my own trajectory is quite kind of complex as well, as someone who works and lives on southern cities, but has had training both across the North and the South. And what we're going to try and do today is to speak both from our own positionalities as scholars and researchers working and living in the South, but also from the point of view of our institutions and the experience that we've had as sort of working as in Southern institutions that are committed, both IHS and ACC are very committed to building partnerships across the South. We work very closely together, actually. I think part of it is to also kind of reflect a little bit on how over the last decade or so, both our institutions have kind of charted their own trajectories, navigating this kind of relationship across Southern and Northern institutions, doing research across the North and the South. Andy, perhaps if I could ask you to start by kind of reflecting a little bit on your experience, both as an individual, but also as from ACC, in engaging with sort of international knowledge sharing platforms and sort of just partnerships across the North, and sort of reflect a little bit on that.
Thanks, Neha. That's a great question, and there's lots to unpack there. So I'll start with the individual. So I think that obviously, as someone that was once based at a Global North institution, when attending, say, big international conferences, I'm a geographer by training, so attending things like the AAG in the US or the RGS IBG conference in the UK, something that was very clear, even though I was based in the North working on the South, because my research has always been about that. There was, I think, 15 years ago or so, a slight uncertainty about the type of work that I was engaged in. So my own research is particularly on sexuality and health in urban South contexts. And I think that what we've seen over the past 15 years or for the past 20 years is a shift far more towards an acceptance of Southern knowledges and obviously the growth in Southern urbanisms. But my experience initially, I think, when I was doing this work and presenting it at international fora, which were based in the North, although they were ostensibly international, was that my research was always viewed in relation to, say, the global North canon on, say, urbanization studies or sexualities or health studies. So my research was always kind of having to speak to a canon which was from elsewhere. And I think that this is an experience that's generally understood to be, to present particular challenges, I think, in terms of the South, and many scholars have written about that. And I think that that is obviously something that has changed dramatically over the past 15 or 20 years. But it was something that I definitely experienced, back in the the mid 2000s, when I was presenting work on somewhere like Cape Town at conferences in places like San Francisco or Washington or London. In terms of the ACC generally, so the ACC is committed, obviously, to having very strong collaborative partnerships across the North and the South. An example of that is a project that we did in collaboration with IIHS and partners at Peking University and EAFIT University, with the PI and the lead being at Oxford University. This was the Peak Urban program. And actually, one of the key outputs of that was a MOOC course, which I think we'll talk a bit more about later. But we've always been wanting to collaborate with Urban North partners, both in terms of knowledge dissemination and in terms of the generation of new knowledge. And it's something that we've been very lucky, I think, and very fortuitous in terms of the types of partners that we have engaged with. For example, Oxford University, partners in Canada, funding bodies in the UK, for example. And there it's perhaps worth reflecting on some of the concerns that have been raised in scholarship generally about potentially unequal relationships between global North and global South partners, both in terms of research production and in terms of knowledge dissemination. And the risk there that's been highlighted in scholarship is that global North partners can inadvertently dictate the rules of the game, so that methodologies and theoretical approaches are kind of fixed at the location in the global North where the primary investigator quite often is. And then global South partners, in effect, are just doing work that's already been kind of predefined on certain tracks in advance of the global South partner being involved. That's not been the experience of the ACC by and large. I think because, for example, in terms of the Peak Urban program, there was a real attempt to have dialogical engagement, both at the level of, say, theoretical approach and in terms of methodology and operational structure. I think the ACC is therefore very aware of the unique and fortuitous position that it's been in terms of engaging with global North partners, because it's also aware of the literature which says that there are challenges in terms of that type of engagement. But Neha, I'd like to ask your reflections actually on this as well.
Sorry, I think I lost you there for a minute, but I think just similarly reflecting from the IHS position, I think I sort of echo almost everything you said, both from my own work as being kind of a female scholar from the South studying in the US, for example, and to have to kind of justify a Southern lens and the choice of work on the South being based at a university in the North. And I think that it was completely there was a lot I learned from being in sort of American universities and working with colleagues across the US. But I think that there was constantly kind of this feeling of having to justify the work that, it's very similar to what you were saying, Andy, about having to justify the work that I was doing and the research sites that I was focused on. And the challenge of kind of participating in sort of conferences in the US and the UK, whether it's RGS or ACSP, for example, or AAG, there was very much kind of this bucketing of all the kind of international folks together without much sort of thought very early on placed to whether it made sense thematically to club those together, or whether, all the kind of non-Western, non-American work just kind of fit together because it was other in some senses. And I think that that in some ways kind of really pushed my own work to kind of articulate it very, very clearly in terms of its kind of location in the South. And to sort of, but also pushed me in some ways as an individual scholar to continue to engage with Northern literature, to actually kind of, to try and sort of indicate, I suppose, that it wasn't in any way less valid because theoretically, because it came from the South. So that had been, I mean, one of the kind of things that I struggled with. And I think we've come a long, long way since then. I think there is a lot more acceptance. There's a lot more kind of awareness of the importance of sort of a Southern lens, both theoretically, but also in terms of practice and policy, and particularly through, projects that we've done together, like Peak Urban, and also other work that sort of we've collaborated with colleagues both in Africa, but also in Latin America on that it's not any less sort of theoretically relevant because it comes from a slightly different location. And sort of this flipping of the gaze of urban theory and urban sort of studies in some senses is sort of one of the main reasons that the IHS sort of research work aims to push quite a bit, is to kind of particularly emphasize Southern partnerships, but also enter into partnerships with like-minded colleagues and partnerships of equality with like-minded colleagues in the North. And that is kind of extremely, extremely important, particularly as I know you guys do, and so do we at IHS teach. And I think that that's a really important kind of element of our pedagogy as well, to be able to emphasize, the fact that Southern scholars and Southern research, is as valid and has actually as much to offer to understanding and unpacking urban futures as anywhere else. So I wonder if Andy, sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
I wonder if you wanted to talk a little bit more about kind of the challenges of taking part in these kind of both partnerships as research partners, but also at various platforms. Part of it, being conferences, but also kind of other kinds of knowledge sharing, like journals, the sort of ways in which knowledge circulates, as being someone particularly from the South.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of journals, that's a really good point to raise, Neha. I mean, there has been debate, I think, about the way in which journals, quite often with editorial boards in the North, can kind of self-censor in the context of urban South scholarship. I think that has shifted. I think that in terms of being able to publish, so for example, the work that a colleague of mine, Neil R. Hassan, and I have been doing on sexuality and health in the former townships of Cape Town. We've been lucky enough to have that published in journals like Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, journals that historically have not necessarily had such overt focus on locations like the townships of Cape Town, particularly in terms of a topic like sexuality, which itself, even within the urban canon, is still somewhat marginalized. So I think that there has been a shift, and I think that's been very productive. And I think that increasingly we see journal editorial calls come through on the wire saying things like, we are particularly interested in scholarship from the South, editors who have experience on this, or who could be a good editorial board member to champion the journal and, in domains beyond what has classically been defined as, say, the urban canon of countries where research comes from. And I think that speaks to a wider shift in terms of the work that's, to fly around flags, the work that groups like IIHS and ACC have done over the past 15 years, to really, as you say, legitimate and value and celebrate the types of work which do come from the South, which are legitimate, which do highlight the parochial nature of what was seen to be universal urban theory, but is now increasingly seen in all types of contexts to be very place specific and not necessarily reflective of locations in the South. I think that we're increasingly seeing that shift. I wouldn't say it's been done entirely. There are still examples here and there of where scholarship from the South has to engage in ways and almost kind of discombobulate itself to fit into structures which aren't necessarily the most appropriate for it. But it's very clear that progress is being made. But I'd also like, to hear your reflections on this and also think through, or perhaps we could start a discussion about the value of Southern institutions having their own international knowledge dissemination platforms.
I think just before that, I just want to add to the question of sort of knowledge circulation, and I think that it in addition to kind of, and we've had discussions about this and we've written together about this as well, is the role that also funding and sort of people, funding bodies make, and the similar to the way editorial boards are structured in sort of a predominantly northern frame, so are funding bodies, and the challenge of submitting sort of research proposals collaboratively, even if sort of the partnerships themselves in the proposals might be those of equality, and sort of everybody's on the same page with that, it often ends up running into sort of a very sort of specific Northern University frame within which sort of work that takes place outside of those contexts doesn't necessarily fly, or needs particular references to a Northern canon, or even at the most basic level needs access to in knowledge that is sort of behind paywalls that are located sort of very practically in the US and the UK and in Europe, which makes it difficult for so-called sort of Southern partners to be competitive in that lens. And so I think that there's a broader kind of knowledge ecosystem that needs, there's a lot of sort of discussion right now about decolonizing curricula and sort of knowledge institutions, but I think that there's a larger kind of political economy itself of knowledge that needs, sort of dismantling and reworking to be able to actually make a difference to how sort of knowledge moves and how sort of knowledge is respected. But I think that sort of, like you were saying, sort of institutions like IHS and ACC are doing quite a lot, but at the same time not perhaps able to do quite enough, because it's sort of it is a huge undertaking. There is a certain kind of politics around the way in which these things function. And I think that what the things that we've tried at IHS to do quite consciously, of course, is, to try and work as much as possible with colleagues and institutions across the South. Because again, the more we do that and the more we're able to write from place and write from our perspectives and sort of teach from our perspectives, I think that makes that's what sort of starts shifting the debate a little bit. And at IHS, we've been doing sort of the Urban Fellows program, which is now in its 7th iteration, which puts out kind of young urban professionals that are from the South but have an interdisciplinary lens. Similarly, through sort of the range of sort of blended learning programs that we offer, of which the Shaping Urban Futures MOOC is one, looks particularly at sort of knowledge that is that emerges from these contexts and enables sort of those who engage with it, both professionals as well as academics, to try and kind of find their voice in a way that is not necessarily sort of speaking to just one particular frame. But I don't know if you wanted to reflect actually on your just recently concluded conference as well, and then maybe I can talk a little bit about IHS's attempts.
Sure, there's so much to cover here. There's lots of ideas just sparking off as we're talking. I mean, just to take your point further before I just speak about the conference, something else that I think that both IIHS and ACC have consciously done which speaks to your broader point about funding, is we've tried to find new ways to create knowledge and to look at the link between, say, theory and practice in ways which don't necessarily always align with your traditional funding application, right? I mean, if we're to look at the big players globally who fund research on urban work, quite often there's a very particular kind of model, I think, which is assumed, which is that you will have certain outputs based on certain methodological processes based around certain key questions. And an example from the ACC side of an activity which we used to have funding for from Mr. Urban Futures. But that program obviously came, it just came to an end because it was time for it to come to an end, and we're very grateful to Mr. For supporting it. But we've decided to continue on this particular element that the program used to do, which is called a knowledge transfer platform, where we engage with City of Cape Town officials and we pair them with academics at the University of Cape Town, quite often at the African Centre for Cities or allied institutions, to co-produce a knowledge product that is of relevant both to the municipality of the City of Cape Town and also contributes towards the canon of urban scholarship in some way. So the academic and the city official both have benefit in terms of co-creating this product. This work, which we do still, is now entirely funded by the ACC. It's not actually something that has external funding, but we see tremendous utility in it because it is about moving beyond that dichotomy between academia and policy or academia and community. And it's about trying to find new and innovative ways of creating research products that speak both towards Southern urbanism and also speak to the particular urgent needs that municipalities can have. So, I mean, just in terms of the fact that I think that, we are located in the South, something that's given us, I think, is a particular, and, please correct me if I'm speaking for you and I'm getting this wrong, but most certainly from the ACC side, something that we've seen is that it's given us an opportunity to rethink what knowledge is and to rethink how we approach the generation of that knowledge. And then the challenge we have is how to align that to, say, Global North funding calls. I mean, that was one of the benefits, I think, of the Peak Urban program, which was funded by GCRF, partly, I think, because of the leadership of people like Professor Michael Keith, who was the PI, but also because it was framed in such a way which was very inductive. So it meant that there was huge creativity that could be put into it to actually skill up the next generation of urban scholars, which was the ultimate aim, in ways which didn't necessarily have to follow the prescripts of traditional funding models. And so there were ways of generating knowledge, there were ways of engaging with each other, which I think were quite innovative. And that should, I think, itself be celebrated. I don't know, Neha, if you've got anything to comment on that before I jump into something about the ACC conferences.
No, I think just to add that I think in addition to what you mentioned about sort of, finding sort of different ways of creating knowledge, I think the other thing that we've tried to do at IHS is also to co-create knowledge with what would traditionally be known or thought of as your research subjects. And so, there's work that we've been doing, for example, I mean, some of my colleagues at IHS have been doing work with labor unions, and they've actually been kind of, instead of only, sort of using them or thinking of them as research subjects, have actually been collectively framing questions with participants in the research process and sort of actively thinking through with them what concrete benefits that they can get out of it. And I think that's very similar in a way to thinking about the ways in which we can actually reimagine the research process, and the fact that the knowledge that we create from that benefits both the participants in the process as well as kind of serving larger sort of funder academic aims as well of kind of shifting the conversation there. So I think that it is actually incredibly important to to think of new ways of also not just creating knowledge, but also creating it together with a larger community of people, and finding ways, I think, of tapping into knowledge that's often not thought of or counted as, sort of legitimate or academic or and so trying to sort of move beyond that binary of what is kind of tacit, what is community knowledge, and sort of finding ways of enabling sort of, ways of opening that up as well.
Yeah, and also then translating that again to the funder, right? In terms of why is this legitimate? Why, if we are going to be co-producing knowledge, if we are going to be co-creating knowledge, it's messy, it's complicated, it's inductive and deductive. Sometimes, it's about surfacing tensions and holding commensurate and incommensurate knowledges together. And those processes are vital, I think, to specifically what you're describing, Neha, about, why we need to co-create. But it's also sometimes very hard to, I think, put down on a Gantt chart and say, we will do this, here, here, and here, because, it's sometimes cyclical. Sometimes you reach a dead end. Sometimes it's about, reconfiguring things as things go on. I mean, something that I think, was made very clear by the COVID pandemic was how both IIHS and ACC were able to very quickly shift and adapt to be able to still continue our research, even though, we couldn't do face-to-face and all those other constraints. But I think that's something that, at least from my experience as Deputy Director of the ACC, was that the ACC was incredibly adept at doing that shift very, very quickly. And we didn't really lose much funding opportunity because of it. But the reason for that is because we had already been skilled in how to kind of proactively and creatively manage these challenges around, say, co-production and having to shift course and having to be dynamic in the way that we do our research. And so I think that that's a key thing as well. Neha, do you have anything to add about that, or should I? Okay. So, I mean, one thing as well that the audience might want to know some of the thinking behind why Neha and I wanted to give this presentation was, or this webinar, was because we wanted to reflect on the degree to which our own, say, international conferences or our own PhD work, conferences and different events feed into these global knowledge systems and circulate in different ways. So the ACC, for example, back in 2018, held an international conference. There was about 500 people there. And then partly because of COVID, we didn't do another one until this week, which was called the African Infrastructure Futures Conference. And it's very clear to me in terms of why those types of activities, which we host ourselves, are also so important in terms of, say, international knowledge generation. It's obviously very important, I think, to bring people together physically, especially after COVID. It's very important to try and, build up those kinds of social capital relationships that are so vital to the types of work that we do. But it's also very clear that, there's still so much unknown in the context of how to address sustainable urban challenges in the urban South, that being at the cutting edge, inverted commas, of that type of endeavor does require people to thrash things out in these conference events. And it's both to speak to international theory and international scholarship, but also to say rooted in the particularities of the urban South condition. And so the African Infrastructure Futures Conference was specifically designed to bring together a wide variety of stakeholders who normally wouldn't come together and most certainly wouldn't come together in, say, a Global North International Conference. We're talking about financial institutions, we're talking about different policy actors, we're talking about municipal leaders such as mayors, we're talking about academics, we're talking about a whole host of different groups to try and think through the complexity of the urban challenge in somewhere like urban Africa, but to do so in a way that's generous, where everyone kind of it is on an equal footing. And that I think is vital, both to energize scholarship from the South in terms of being, academics being exposed to such a wide range of stakeholders. And it's also vital, I think, in terms of legitimating to policymakers, to international NGOs, to financial institutions, the validity and the value add which academics can bring to the party, can bring to the conversation. And I think that that's something that is quite unique in the context specifically of Southern urban debates, because these are sometimes, they feel like intractable challenges. How can you actually support urban growth when you're talking about large-scale informality, when you're talking about a demographic youth bulge, when you're talking about large-scale social spatial inequality. And so, I think that having knowledge platforms like, ACC international conferences, like the one we had this week, do have particular utility that I think emerge from our own positionality in the Open South. But Neha, I'd love to hear more on you about this.
So actually quite similarly, for the last kind of 7 or 8 years or so, IHS has been running what we call our annual research week, which happens every year in the second week of January. And that is sort of focused very much on 2 things. One is on providing a platform for Southern scholarship. But the second is also primarily providing space for younger scholars from the South who often don't get access to and are not able to necessarily travel to the conferences that we were mentioning early on, sort of the RDSs and AAGs, etc., which are both in some ways sort of geographically and spatially located out of reach, but also are often prohibitively expensive to get to in terms of registration fees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we very specifically actually don't have a registration fee. The conferences and the proceedings and the conference is streamed live on the IHS kind of YouTube channel. And we sort of actually almost preface that with a 3-day intense doctoral workshop, again, focused primarily on sort of scholars and young researchers, of course, PhD scholars from the South, to be able to sort of provide, in a very kind of structured way, feedback and capacity building that often a lot of them are unable to get, and the mentoring that they're unable to get at their own sort of home institutions. And we sort of intentionally co-locate the PhD workshop with the conference, because even if doctoral students feel that they're not ready to present on a sort of public platform like a conference, just being around and absorbing knowledge from other scholars, particularly other scholars from the South, people who've kind of, been through this process a while before, is an incredibly sort of valuable learning experience. And we've seen kind of year after year, the number of people who want to come and sort of participate has just kind of increased. And we've kind of become, we end up having sort of, IHS groupies in some senses, people who just keep coming back to the conference, just because it's now become a community of people that they feel comfortable engaging with. And I wish I'd had sort of spaces like that as a young researcher. And I think that there's an incredible value to having having those. And I think the one thing actually that since you mentioned the pandemic, the one thing that COVID did do for us, especially with the conference, is that it sort of streamlined things like Zoom, which has kind of really opened up and so this year's conference is actually going to be hybrid, and we have folks who are going to be presenting from all over the world, and sort of we work our panels around so that we can kind of accommodate different time zones, we can accommodate sort of people. And so we, I think there's a lot beyond just kind of providing the platform, but also being as enabling as possible to both scholars as well as sort of audiences, to be able to sort of actually create a community of knowledge across. And I mean, I think the other thing with I think similar to sort of ACC is that the IHS Research Conference offers a space for sort of reflective work, but not necessarily only from academics. And so we've had people, who are from sort of the private corporate sector taking a little bit of time to step back and reflect on their work. We've had aid organizations, and we've had sort of people from sort of community networks sit alongside academics on the same panel. And that itself is also an incredibly enriching experience for not only the people kind of on the panel, but also for the audience to actually see multiple positionalities reflected, as kind of people talk and present their work.
Yeah, I mean, I think Neha, you've hit the nail on the head there. It's about the democratization of knowledge in terms of both how we go about creating it and about the different types of partners that we bring into that discussion. So the curating power, I think, of IIHS is immense, right? That it has this brand recognition now, that it can bring around the table such diverse stakeholders, that it's known as a safe space, that it's a space where you can have, complex discussions. And, it's valued, I think, internationally because of that, as much as it is, say, in India. And that's definitely a key strength, I think, that the ACC and myself in particular see in the context of what IIHS has done and will hopefully continue to do. I mean, just reflecting back on an earlier point to do with funding, I mean, it's kind of interesting that both ACC and IIHS are largely soft funded, right? In that we don't have large endowments. And obviously the precarity of academic work, generally, I think we've seen, it's not just a global South phenomenon. I think that we've seen the neoliberalization of the higher education sector globally, leading to increased precarity, people on short-term contracts, that don't get renewed, non-tenure track positions, all those types of things. But I wanted to ask you, Neha, in the context specifically of the activities that IIHS does, because it is overwhelmingly soft-funded, like the ACC, if that creates any particular challenges in terms of this very unique approach which you have.
I mean, yes, very much so. And I think that we've been very fortunate, and we've been, kind of working very hard, and sometimes have often had to let things go because it didn't speak to either our philosophy or our principles of engagement. And we often choose to not work with funders, partners, donors that are not aligned to our overall kind of mission and values. And those are obviously difficult decisions to make, particularly in a context, like India, that actually doesn't have a very kind of robust sort of funding ecosystem. It doesn't have as much of a, sort of a research funding space domestically. And so almost paradoxically, to be able to do the work that we want to do, we do need to rely on funding that comes from outside the country. And I think that, and that's sort of a much harder kind of puzzle to crack in some ways, of how to kind of invert that flow and to sort of start refocusing and sort of shift the kind of locus of research funding away from the north in some senses, because that really, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. And when that starts to happen is, I think, when things will pivot really, really dramatically. But so far, I mean, I think that it has been difficult, but I think we've also been fortunate enough to have sort of partners across the world that we can keep turning back to, and who are both across the North and the South. And I think that more than anything else at IHS, we really value those relationships and we sort of nurture them. And so I think that, like with ACC, but also with colleagues at the development planning unit, at sort of in UCL, several universities across the US. There's a lot of kind of partnerships of equality and equivalence that we have, that we respect and value very, very deeply. And so, this is not at all to say that it's not possible to work collegially with sort of folks across the North and the South. And I think that what I would actually like to say, that it's very much possible. It just is a lot of work on both sides. I mean, I think everybody has to really sort of put their shoulders to the wheel and push.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, as you described there, the kind of transactional overhead that IIHS and ACC have to engage in, right? It's a constant challenge, as you say. It's never the case that we can kind of sit back and rest on our laurels. It's always the case that that needs to be hustling, you know, to draw on, say, Tatiana Thames' work on the urban South. I mean, I'm not sure that, you know, the analogy necessarily holds. We're not waste pickers in Nairobi, but there is something about how there's that constant need of engagement, and it takes time. And something that Neha, as you mentioned earlier, something that Neha and I have contributed to is a series of interventions that are coming out in IJA, the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. And Neha, your submission in particular, I mean, hopefully these are coming out in the next couple of days. I mean, they've been about to come out for a while, and I think everything's signed and sealed now, so hopefully they'll appear soon. But I wanted just to push a bit more on this point, Neha, because your contribution to that special issue, or that series of interventions, is specifically about that transactional overhead, right? And I wondered if there was any other reflections to make about that.
I think that honestly, it is really, I think there's the question of precarity, as you put it, and I think that, like you said, it's the precariousness is not only faced by scholars in the South. You know, we've seen colleagues across the North and the South struggle with very similar questions. But I think that the impact of, you know, change, the impact of things like, for example, the COVID pandemic and sort of associated funding cuts that came with it, do kind of affect Southern institutions a lot more because of the absence of that larger kind of ecosystem of research. And so the institutions themselves don't actually have the ability to absorb those shocks and bounce back. It takes a lot longer for institutions in some sense to bounce back. There's also the question of time. I mean, I think that, you know, we've again been very fortunate to be able to build long-term partnerships with institutions and individuals across the North and the South, and in part because we've had kind of funders who understood the importance of that. But increasingly, I think, you know, there's less and less of that around. There's a lot more of sort of projectization of research, of kind of, you know, having to have very specific targets to meet. And while I sort of understand and appreciate all of it, and I completely recognize the urgency of needing to have implementable, you know, kind of research solutions that are able to kind of have impact on the ground, I think that we also run the risk of not being able to kind of carry partnerships forward if they're very kind of projectized and sort of just chopped up in ways. And I think that a couple of the other interventions, I think from our colleague in Colombia, was also talking about how, you know, sort of capacity building struggles in Southern institutions. And I think that speaks very, very strongly to how kind of, in some ways, how dependent, you know, sort of Southern institutions are on partnerships. But also, I think just to kind of also go back to your intervention in that collection, to talk a little bit about how, you know, it's not just a dependency that's one way, especially intellectually and theoretically, and to talk about sort of what value exists in the partnerships intellectually for sort of researchers across the North and the South, and why it is absolutely important that we don't kind of, you know, become sort of informants and subjects from the South and sort of theory from the North kind of divisions. I don't know if you want to reflect on that at all.
Sure, yeah. So our colleague from Colombia is Juan Carlos Duque, who's actually on this call, I think, as well. So just if you're interested, the total submissions are, there's a piece by Neha, there's a piece by Juan Carlos, there's a piece by Professor Susan Parnell and Professor Michael Keith, and there's a piece that I did. So that's just a quick advertorial to tell you about those issues which are coming out. In terms of your question, Neha, I think it also speaks to, say, the wider question that this webinar is circulating around in the context of, say, the international. And something that I wrote about in the in my intervention is that there needs to be the space and time for creativity to emerge in the South. And an example I give is how it's kind of interesting up until now, and it's a very particular example I draw on, but I think it does have wider applicability. It's very interesting how up until now, work on the urban South in terms of health has not engaged with the question of sexuality. And that, you could argue, on the one hand, is because, particularly when you're talking about, say, health and sexuality in the urban South, particularly in somewhere like sub-Saharan Africa, you have to talk about HIV/AIDS, right? In somewhere like South Africa, it's a non-negotiable, right? But urban health scholars have not gone there. And a potential reason that I talk about in my intervention is that if you look at the trajectory of where urban health scholarship generally is globally, particularly, say, in the global North, HIV/AIDS is a chronic condition, right? It's not a life-threatening disease in the same way it is in places with very poor access to healthcare generally, and with limited adherence to ARV treatments. Whereas in the global North, the cliche, and it is a bit of a cliche, but the cliche is that HIV/AIDS is like diabetes now, right? You just take your pills and you'll be okay. But obviously in the urban South, that isn't the case. And so it's kind of interesting that something that the Peak Urban Project allowed was the space to be reflexive and the space to be creative and the space to create new links in terms of, say, health, sexuality in the urban. And this also goes back to the work I've been doing with my colleague Neil R. Hassan. And then that in and of itself can then be generative, both in terms of, say, putting on the map internationally why such links are important, but also crucially, I think, potentially opening up new funding pots. And this goes back to your point, Neha, as well, about, say, a realignment away from the traditional sources of funding to think through, well, maybe there are other funders, other people who urban scholars have not necessarily engaged with, who could be directly generative in terms of the impact they could have on urban scholarship in the South. And the example I give in my intervention is the fact that the United States government, which is the largest single country supporter of addressing HIV/AIDS globally, has spent something like $90 billion trying to address HIV/AIDS, which pre-COVID was the largest single health intervention by any country in the history of humanity. And yet, despite that, urban scholars have not engaged with funders such as PEPFAR, which is kind of ironic when you think that in terms of, say, hotspot locations and particular risk, it's overwhelmingly in cities that you're talking about HIV risk, right? And I mean, not in all cases, but in many, many cases. And so there's clearly an urban dimension to HIV work. And there's the potentiality there if you leverage programs like Peak Urban to actually say there's new stuff out there, there's new ways in which we can engage that can not only shift the international needle in terms of what is and what isn't important and what is valid as types of urban research, it can also potentially be leveraged to generate new research funds. So I think that that's another way in which we can frame some of these questions. But sorry, Neha, go for it.
No, go ahead. No, I just wanted to sort of ask you to reflect a little bit more on sort of how the engagement with, I suppose, just global partnerships and international partnerships has influenced both your positionality, but also your participation, both as an individual researcher, but also from sort of an institutional perspective in certain events. So, sort of, do you still kind of, to what extent, in some ways, do you feel like the RGSs and the AAGs and things are still kind of relevant and important, and sort of this engagement with knowledge platforms across the North and the South in some senses?
Thanks, Neha. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the AAGs and the RGSs are vitally important. And I think that the shift and the reason for that is because they are still very much the gravity center around which other things circulate. It's just in terms of, say, CV points, in terms of engagement, in terms of career progression. These big conferences are very important. They're also very important because they expose you to other things. I've learned a tremendous amount by going to these conferences about topics which sometimes I never thought would have relevance on my thinking, but actually do. And it's sometimes like the lucky happenstance which happens at these events, which really does create a very generative environment. It can do that. Equally, I think IIHS's events can do that, and I think ACC's events can do that. But I think that the sheer scale of something like the AAG is something that we need to engage with, and it's not something that I think we should. It's not an either or. It's not a question of we don't do AAG, we just do something else. It's about, no, actually, there are things that can still be very supportive. Something that I notice as well about things like the AAG, and it goes back to a point I made earlier, is it's very different now to what it was 15 years ago, right? I think that there's definitely a far wider appreciation of the Southern knowledges question. And I think that is increasingly being seen in the types of topics and the types of sessions that are being put forward. I don't think we're ever going to go back to how it was 15 years ago. And, I kind of chuckled when you gave that example of, all the other countries were grouped into one session, as though it was somehow, it was like the rest kind of go into this block over here, because I certainly remember that type of engagement before, but I think that has now changed. And I think that's very much because of the work of groups like IIHS and perhaps also ACC, but it's also because I think scholarship in the North, lots of, say, the big names get it, right, or are increasingly getting it, and they appreciate why there is utility and value to the types of debates which we're now bringing. I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, Neha. Do you think there's been a shift?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that there's also kind of, I think there's definitely been a change, particularly in urban studies, in sort of how scholars are approaching it. And I think that there's been a very concerted effort. And I think, I really do want to sort of appreciate the amount of sort of effort that scholars who are located and based in sort of universities and across editorial boards and funders, etc., in sort of northern institutions have been pushing also for a wider, more inclusive set of scholarship. And I think that speaks back to actually sort of this kind of collegiality that we've experienced with colleagues in the UK and the US and in Europe, where they do genuinely respect the work and sort of see you as equal partners intellectually, and sort of are very, very committed to the idea of co-creation and co-production of research. And I think that has absolutely been, I think, because of the growing number of institutions and scholars located in the South, that are kind of, that have a very sort of clear voice of their own and, are not kind of shy to demand space. I think that's important, but I think equally important is that we do have sort of solidarity and colleagues across the board who are also, I think, in recognizing, like you said, sort of the importance of kind of sharing knowledge. And I think that there's something that I think emerged very strongly out of the work that all of us did through Peak Urban, was really that, a lot of the challenges are very similar, like the kind of urban questions and challenges that we face across northern and southern cities are very, very similar. And if we're not able to kind of address them as the challenges that they are, we're not really going to move forward very much in being actually able to have kind of impact on the ground in lots of different ways. And so I think that our kind of, I mean, the MOOC is one example of this, the Shaping Urban Futures MOOC is one example of this, where we worked quite hard to kind of, translate some of the kind of knowledge that the primary knowledge that we collected through 5 years of research on the ground across, sort of multiple locations and institutions and partners, to be able to kind of distill it into something that we hope not just academics, but also policymakers and practitioners will find useful. And I think that the sort of this whole idea of this kind of new urban science, which tries to bring, which is also, I think, one of the sort of overarching frameworks around peak urban as well, is sort of this idea of not, sort of breaking it up into these silos of the North and the South and the policy and practice and academia, but the fact that if we don't kind of work across a lot of these, we're not really going to see any shift, any movement, both in sort of knowledge and knowledge creation and those who produce that knowledge, but also how that knowledge is translated and how it feeds into policy making and practice and teaching.
Yeah, entirely. I mean, I think that the MOOC, the Shaping Urban Futures MOOC, Neha, as you mentioned, it is a clear example as to why projects like Peak Urban are important, because it shows how you can have over 40 projects in 5 different countries, all ostensibly doing their own thing, but within the framework set out by Peak Urban. And I encourage you to go to the Peak Urban website to see more about what that framing is. But how, despite you have such the fact you have such plurality, you can also have such coherence when it comes to an online training course. And I think that it's because the project was both inductive, and then the MOOC kind of made it deductive in terms of putting it into a story or a series of stories about the future of urban science, about the future of what prediction can mean, what emergent urban forms are, what the adoption of different technological changes are, and what knowledge exchange means, that you could actually have coherence over such a wide range of different examples. And it is, I think, an exemplar of the types of scholarship which will be needed in the future.
Actually, on that note, I think we have a set of actually quite interesting questions on some of this kind of idea of knowledge transfer, and particularly on peak urban. So I don't know, Andy, if you wanted, there's actually a really interesting question about examples of indigenous practices from the South that have been sort of traveled, moved, and been effectively used in the North. And I don't know if there's anything from your work, and particularly from sort of that IDEA intervention that you wanted to highlight.
Do you want to go first? I'm just opening the questions.
Sure.
Sorry,
I think that one of the things, and thank you for that question. I think it's a really, really important one. And I think that in particular, I think that there's, I'm not sure I know of examples specifically of indigenous practices that have traveled, but I think the one thing that we did through another a project at IHS with colleagues at the development planning unit was to run a series of workshops for community participants and for community activists that that had sort of this emphasis on just sort of co-learning. So it wasn't like we were faculty and sort of there were sort of students in the class, but the program itself and the knowledge itself was created together with community activists to kind of build skills within the community to deal with evictions, for example, or legal challenges that specific housing rights activists, for example, were facing. And then that knowledge has been translated into sort of non-verbal learning materials, which use sort of sketches, which use diagrams and sort of images, and that has translated to housing rights activists in Peru, in other parts of Latin America, but also to other parts of Africa. And so I'm not quite sure it goes to the sort of indigenous voices and knowledge question, but it definitely does, I think, speak to how we can sort of harness and actually co-create knowledge beyond just conventional academics and sort of knowledge production.
Yeah, I can have a go at answering that one as well. It's a great question. And I think that something which I would query in its context, and it's not to negate the importance of the question, but it's to reframe what we mean by indigenous. Because I think there's different ways we can come to understand that. And I'm going to give one example as to what I mean. A colleague of mine at ACC, Liza Trolia, who was part of the Peak Urban program, wrote this article as part of Peak Urban on the ways in which economic migrants in South Africa transfer remittances back to their home countries elsewhere on the continent. And what was very clear from that was that the ways in which these migrants were doing financial transfers were entirely unique and original, and brought together in a kind of almost an assemblage different actors, different networks. And so it wasn't just the Western Union model of how you do financial remittances. It was very much about WhatsApp groups. It was about paper ledgers. It was about the fact that the money didn't actually move. It was the fact that the people that were doing these transfers were almost acting like a bank. So it wasn't that you physically transferred money, or virtually, because everything's online now, but it was the fact that WhatsApps were sent to different places and money was kind of drawn down from different accounts in different parts of the world. The reason why I'm giving that as an example is because, is that indigenous? Or is that some kind of global local hybrid, right? Because it requires particular, say, trust networks, which you could say are very particular to particular migrant communities. But it also requires the use of WhatsApp, right? And it requires different technological interventions from different parts of the world. And it's not to negate the fact that there are no doubt indigenous knowledges as well, which are very important, which can potentially speak through to the urban north or to international theory. But it is also to say that something that we have, I think, kind of consciously and unconsciously explored is how there is this globalization, this glocalization occurring, and definitions between local, global, indigenous, international, I think are categories that we've seen increasingly being blurred as well.
Is there another question that you'd like to pick up, Andy?
I'm looking at the questions now. Yeah, I can do the data poverty question and data quality. So that's actually a really fascinating question, because a big component, and there's two ways I'd like to answer it. A big component of the Peak Urban project was urban science, which in some ways gets interpreted very much about being about big data, about AI, about large-scale data sets. And obviously, as the question very clearly highlights, that there can be data poverty questions, there can be data quality questions when it comes to the urban South. So in terms of how the ACC engaged with this, because it was obviously part of Peak Urban, it was engaging with urban science, but it was also doing it in contexts where data quality may not be that strong. And also for someone like the ACC, that hardcore quantitative analysis has not really formed a core component of what we've done before. We were very conscious in our engagements with Peak to have a wider definition of what we meant by urban science. So it was as much about the institutional implications of technological change as it was about, and the community implications, as it was about AI or large-scale mapping. The other thing I would say, though, is I was just on a panel. I was chairing a panel at our African Infrastructure Futures Conference, all about the role of research in the context of urban change. And one of the key contributors was from an organization called GCRO, the Gauteng City Regional Observatory. And their purpose, in many ways, being based in Johannesburg, in South Africa, is to try and find data analytics that are important and valuable to policymakers. And it is about quantitative data as much as it is about qualitative data. And so the reason why I give that as a second way of answering the question is, yes, there is data scarcity. Yes, there are these challenges, but they're not insurmountable, because groups like GCRO are doing amazing work at being able to address these types of challenges. Just as within the Peak Urban Project, another Peak Urban Project that the ACC did, led by Dr. Amy Wyman, was focused on a large-scale household data survey, which had been done in parts of Cape Town, and thinking about how to connect that to different institutional imperatives. So yes, it's a problem, but I don't think it's an insurmountable problem. And increasingly, we're seeing more and more examples to highlight that.
I think there's also a really interesting question on how experiences on sort of across the urban in the South aren't uniform, and to think of sort of, you know, this whether we need, or is it even possible to have a unified theoretical framework for the South. And sort of, and I don't know what you think about that, Andy, but I think absolutely, you know, I completely agree that we have to have sort of layers and nuances, and sort of, you know, even within a country like India, you know, the experience of a large city is definitely not the same as a smaller city. And I think that it goes back a little bit to what we've been saying before, is that sort of place matters and context matters. And I think that I don't think either of us or the others who sort of talk about a Southern theory at all mean that we need to have a unified kind of single lens on how we understand urbanization in the South, but that it needs to speak of, from, and for the South. And I don't think that we think either that sort of theory that's created in the North is not relevant. But I think that it is equally important to root it in place. And so, you know, all of the nuance and all of the complexity that comes with rooting it in space, I think is sort of as necessary as with any other, you know, sort of framework that tries to explain phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, Neha's summary that I think is brilliant. Just to pull out something from it, I think that it's about the political imperative, right? It's about being for, of, and with the South. And that's what gives it both intellectual and political utility, I think. It's not about a grand, all-encompassing theory of everything. And there are scholars who are, you know, clearly working on acknowledging that and thinking through how exactly do we approach the South in ways which don't homogenize it, but which also don't, you know, fall into a never-ending cycle of empiricism and just case studies of difference, right? I'm thinking here, for example, of Jenny Robinson's work on comparative urbanism, and there's other scholars as well. And, you know, that work is ongoing, but it starts from a perspective of why you would want to in the context of being from the South. And that, I think, is a very refreshing and very valid position to start from. Shall I take the language question?
Yes, please.
So there's a question here. The Peak Urban program included partners across countries and languages. How did this linguistic heterogeneity help or hamper the research process, especially in terms of interpreting local knowledge and context? So it is something that is it's continually acknowledged, I think, within Peak Urban, that we had many different languages. And there's something here as well. It's something that we haven't really spoken about in the context of of our discussion, perhaps we might want to reflect on now. It's about the hegemony of that kind of Anglo approach to scholarship. I say this very much as someone with a British accent, so I'm well aware that I'm complicit in this as well. But it is also to say that, for example, we've had discussions about translating the MOOC into other languages, so that it, or at the very least subtitling it, so that it is accessible to wider populations. It's also something I think that, even beyond peak urban, it's something that ACC has been acutely aware of, right? We are based in Cape Town in South Africa, where one of the key languages in South Africa is English, which means that we have tended to skew towards countries in Africa that also have English as a language, okay? Which means that we have had limited penetration relatively. I mean, we still do work there, but relatively. There's been less penetration into, say, Francophone Africa and Lusophone. We have done bits of that. We've done what a colleague who's now at WITS but used to be at the African Centre for Cities, Dr. Sylvia Cruz. She particularly has worked in places like Angola, and we've also done work in Mozambique. But the language challenge, I think, is something that, especially I think in years to come, needs to be grappled with more directly. Because I think as well, when we're talking about, say, urban theory and urbanisms from the South or from the North, we are doing so in the context of the English language. And I think that there are particular schools and genealogies of knowledge, for example, from Latin America, which are very different. And there needs to be more acknowledgement and engagement about, the histories of intellectual thought, which have in some ways been ring-fenced because of the languages that they occur in other than English.
I mean, I think it like you said, it goes beyond just peak urban. I think it's something that we struggle with at IHS, even sort of within India. Like, we're located in a country that's so multilingual, and yet a lot of our teaching and a lot of our is in English, and it really is something that we struggle with a lot, because a lot of our students and our research subjects and sort of the sort of government officials that we work with, for them English is not a primary language at all, and it often feels deeply disrespectful at times to be able to be sort of working in English, particularly when that means excluding people from the conversation. We encourage our students to create a vocabulary of commonly used terms in their own languages, to sort of be able to understand and explain practice, and so we're kind of over the years starting to build this repository of at least a dictionary in some senses of words that can move across multiple languages. But the other is also just small things like at our conferences, offering a little bit of translation to enable sort of non-English speakers to present, to be able to kind of small kind of gesture, but it really does go a long way in making people feel included, and also sort of broadening the conversation just beyond sort of, I think, an English language debate. I mean, there's a sort of a much deeper question which goes back to sort of the political economy of knowledge production and how sort of journals sort of circulate and the languages in which they circulate, etc. And I think that's sort of a topic for a conversation at another time. But I do think that the question of language goes beyond sort of research projects, and sort of really just influences a lot about how knowledge is produced and circulates, and of course is validated.
Yeah, entirely. I see there's two questions which are kind of linked. A question about your thoughts on students from the Global South studying in the Global North about Southern contextual problems with the aim of working for the Global South eventually, and also a question about what advice for aspiring early career urban researchers to acquire knowledge from across different geographies, communities, languages, and cultures, and how they can share their learning or research at this stage of their careers. They're kind of linked, maybe. I can have a go. I think that in terms of studying in the North, sorry, the question's just moved across boxes, so I'm just reading it again. The question about studying in the global North about Southern contextual problems, I think that there's, tremendous benefit to travel and to go to different contexts to study in different ways. It's not to say that, just because you're from the South, you should stay in the South. I mean, global North researchers haven't been doing that. They've been coming to the South and doing research. I'm one of them, right? So I think that, the idea of going somewhere else to study generally can be a great thing, right? But that need not always imply that if you're from the South, you're going to the North. You can be going from the South to the South. An example is the Masters in Southern Urbanism that the ACC does, which is specifically designed to attract the next generation of urban scholars, particularly Black scholars from across the continent. That's someone from, say, Ethiopia coming to Cape Town, someone from Kenya coming to Cape Town. I think that there's benefit in thinking about those types of connections, not to negate what can happen when scholars from the South go to the North as well. And in terms of the question, in terms of any advice, that's a tricky one. I think it's about, well, I mean, if you want to be an academic, it's about, you've got to write the journal articles. It's the key commodity, you could say, that we circulate within. But it's also about being creative, right? It's about thinking how you can give back to the communities that you're researching about in ways that benefit them, right? They're not going to read the journal article. Quite often this journal article may be behind a paywall, which means that even if they wanted to, they couldn't afford to. So it's about thinking through what utility there is and how you might operationalize that utility to give back to communities in ways that are supportive of them. I think that we have a kind of ethical obligation to do that generally when doing research, and most certainly in the context of communities that have historically been marginalized, be it through colonialism or other systems of injustice. So I think that, it doesn't just speak to aspiring early career researchers. I think it speaks to all researchers that the idea of sharing learning is absolutely key. Otherwise, we're just talking to ourselves.
I mean, I think just to add to that, it also goes back to this sort of idea of creating knowledge collectively, right? And to not kind of see one or the other as having more or less in some sense, and think of how it is that we can actually create knowledge in a way that is sort of doesn't all, and research often does come with sort of power relationships inbuilt. And I think to be able to acknowledge that and to be able to think through how, it doesn't always have to be like that, I think is a really important way of going forward. I think that, I mean, just also to go back to this question of sort of students from the South going to the North and then coming back to the South, I mean, that's pretty much me. And I think that I'm very grateful to have had the privilege of doing that. I fully recognize and I'm aware that there's a lot of people who would like to do it and didn't. And I think that I think is equally important, is that, I had the privilege of choice and to be able to make that choice. And I think that it's always important to remember that, and to go with sort of this open-minded kind of way of, wanting to learn and absorb and sort of grow as much as possible from as many, and to be able to sort of learn from as many different sources as you can, but to also then kind of have, in some senses, the courage of your convictions to say, this is where, this is how I learn, and this is how I sort of situate my own work within this larger context. And I think it goes back to what we were both saying a little while ago, is that, in some senses, it's not very useful to continue to hold on to that north-south binary, partly because yes, I mean, that does exist spatially and politically and geographically, but I think intellectually it's beginning to blur quite a bit. And I think that one of the greatest kind of ways of doing that is to move, if you can, across physically across these spaces and boundaries. And if you do have the ability to do it, I would, encourage you to take advantage of that. There is sort of one question on sort of minimal neighborhoods that we haven't really answered, but I'm not really sure. I'm sort of, I know a whole lot about it, and so I think, Lakshmi, if you write to us, maybe we can direct you to resources that you'd be able to, that would be able to sort of inform your question much better than at least I, for one, feel capable of doing. I don't know, Andy, if you have any knowledge that you might be able to share about it, but if not, if you send us an email, we'd be happy to send you resources that will perhaps help.
Yep.
I don't know if there are any other, there are other more questions. Oh, that's a good one. Is there a successor to Peak? I wish there was. I don't know, Andy, if you know of.
Yeah, there is no successor at the moment. It would be great if there was. It was a phenomenal program. But I would just say as well that, we've spoken a lot about the challenges that can happen in terms of different types of funding regimes. But it is also to acknowledge that the needle is starting to shift. And although there's not another peak urban, there is, for example, I'd like to give a call out actually to one of our funders at the moment, Grand Challenges Canada, GCC. There are groups out there like GCC who are specifically trying to do things differently. And something that I noticed when I was on a call with them when we got awarded some money to actually do follow-on research from Peak Urban, we had a group call with all the groups who had received funding. And the thing that shocked me, and I remember saying to a colleague at the time, was the sheer number of partners who had never received international funding before, who had been specifically targeted, you could say. I mean, obviously their proposals were very good, but the ACCs in that room, there weren't many of us who had experience and had been, playing the funding system or the funding game for many years. That there are, increasingly, I think, these rays of light where you see people, funders, consciously going for ideas and topics in parts of the world that have not historically been the focus of research attention, and most certainly not of the big funding agencies. GCC, I think, is one example of that, and I'm sure there are others. So I think it's really about missioning, right? It's about putting on your detective hat and seeing what you can find, because I think that there are increasingly opportunities out there. There's not as many as there should be, but I think that there are increasingly examples where we are seeing a shift.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I really have anything else to add to that right now. But if there are any other questions, we have, I think, a couple of minutes. If not, I think I'd just like to thank all of you for coming. It's been very fun for us, and I hope it was fun for you. You can find sort of more information on IHS, on ACC, on the Peak Urban Project, and the Shaping Urban Futures MOOC. There are links in the chat. And if you write to us, we'd be happy to share more information on any of the things that we've discussed today. And with that, thank you very much, Andy. for taking the time at the end of a very long week. And we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you, IIHS, and thank you to the wonderful audience.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.